In the previous lecture, we addressed ways in which the culture in which a person grows up can have substantial influence on the patterns of behavior that person adopts. From this cultural information, people learn which behaviors are perceived as appropriate and which are perceived as inappropriate. An important part of this cultural experience is learning how to relate to those individuals around us, especially those in one's family and those in one's immediate community. A number of scholars have looked closely at this issue of how one relates to those with whom he or she interacts on a regular basis. This is often referred to as one's social networks. In the previous lecture, I described two contrasting concepts of the self, the independent self and the interdependent self. From the independent perspective, one is encouraged to pursue his or her own goals, independently from those in the surrounding social network. By contrast, the interdependent self maintains a sense of connectedness to those around her or him and often works to attain what is best for the entire social group rather than what is best for her or him individually. Those involved in the study of social networks will often look at the entire array of individuals in a person that a person is in contact with, either on a regular basis or on an occasional basis. For example, in 2014, tobacco policy researcher Erin Mead and her colleagues published a study describing how various levels of normative influence coming from a person's interaction with her or his social networks affect their smoking behavior. These networks involve personal relationships with others as well as more general social interactions, either with individuals or with other groups of individuals. From these networks, individuals come to understand the norms of behavior that are expected of them. Mead differentiates between those in one's proximal network and those in what she refers to as one's distal network. Mead describes proximal networks as involving principally family and close friends, while the distal network involves neighbors, classmates, and others with whom one has regular contact, but without necessarily forming close personal bonds. The proximal networks tend to have more influence in setting behavior for young children in pre-adolescence. As the children grow older, they will often develop stronger and stronger relationships with those previously in their distal network, and those in the distal network will exert an increasing influence on behavior. In her own work, Mead addresses how adolescents' decisions of whether to begin smoking is affected by these networks. She describes how distal social networks often come to define groups and group memberships that are separate and distinct from family. As one moves into adolescence and begins to develop an identity separate from family, it is common to model that identity on the social group or groups one either feels part of or hopes to become part of. Independent of family, if an adolescent perceives herself or himself as similar to one of these alternative groups, he or she is likely to adopt behaviors such as smoking, modeled on the perceived social norms of that group. What though if the norms and expectations of the proximal network conflict with those of the distal network? If one's parents try to discourage smoking while one's peers are smoking on a regular basis and thereby encouraging smoking, how does one respond? Mead suggests that, quote, when sources of normative information from the social network are in conflict, youth will often conform to the smoking norms and behaviors of their close peers. Of course, when both the proximal and distal networks both encourage smoking, the risk of becoming a smoker goes up. Writing in 1986, Teifel and Turner described this process as one of establishing a social identity, which, quote, consists of those aspects of an individual's self-image that derive from the social categories to which he perceives himself as belonging, unquote. As part of social identity theory, there is a natural tendency for social groups to compare themselves to other groups that have adopted different attributes and characteristics of group membership, and to create boundaries between theirs as the in-group and the other groups as the out-groups. Groups then rank themselves and their members based upon this perceived status. This competition for status can easily lead to intergroup conflict. In 2011, Walton and Cohen described how one comes to share values and motivations with his or her social group. They underscored the influence of this social identity and suggested that, quote, people develop interests with and from others to whom they are socially connected, unquote. If those interests involve behaviors that are beneficial to well-being, such as education or regular exercise, then the affected individual is more likely to adopt these. Conversely, if those behaviors are potentially harmful to well-being, the individual who sees herself or himself as a group member and draws value from that membership will be more likely to adopt these unhealthy behaviors as well. Particularly in Western cultures where the independent self is the common cultural norm, Walton and Cohen suggest that people from Western cultures perform a balancing act. On the one hand, they have a great need to belong. On the other hand, they maintain an independent self-concept, seeing themselves as agentic and unique. Sociologist Pierre Bourdieu carried this analysis a step further. In addition to deriving guidance in behavioral norms from one's social network, Bourdieu suggested that individuals actually gain added capital value from these group memberships. Writing in 1986, Bourdieu suggested that capital can exist in multiple forms. When the various forms of capital have in common is that they can be accumulated through labor, they can be used to influence others, and they can be passed to descendants. In addition to what we have traditionally recognized as economic capital, in the form of economic assets and income, Bourdieu suggested that individuals may also possess cultural capital and social capital. Bourdieu described cultural capital as existing in three different states, as one's acquired knowledge or talents, one's material objects such as books or works of art, and one's certificates of academic or professional qualifications such as academic degrees or professional licenses. Social capital, on the other hand, derives largely from the social connections and contacts one has. As described by Bourdieu, social capital is the aggregate of the actual or potential resources which are linked to possession of a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition, or in other words, to membership in a group. The more social network connections one has, and the more one can draw on these connections to maintain and gain needed resources, the more social capital one possesses. Two aspects of these various forms of capital are of particular interest from the perspective of understanding behavior. First, there's a certain degree of interchangeability among them. Those with greater economic capital can acquire greater cultural capital through the expenditure of economic resources. Similarly, those with greater cultural capital, at least as perceived by others, may find it easier to create and then draw upon social network connections. The second aspect is that these forms of capital are often transmissible across generations. Economic capital can simply be passed on to one's heirs as a formal inheritance. As we have seen, cultural capital in its various forms can also be transmitted to the next generation through supporting the development in one's children of a sense of self-efficacy and belief in the value of education, an important part of which is the availability and regular use of books. Similarly, children often grow up getting to know as friends the children of those who they are socially connected with through their parents, thus adding to their own social capital.